If they used the Flemish phrase, brot und Kasse, that was proof. They were dragged away and their heads were cut off. After the first chaotic day in London that had seen the destruction of the Savoy Palace and summary executions on the street, the peasants had turned the world upside down. Holed up inside the tower, the king was presiding over a desperate debate about strategy. Some wanted to launch an immediate attack on the rebels, but Richard sided with those who counselled delaying tactics. He sent a message to the rebels. To determine the fate of his kingdom, the next day he would meet them face to face. England was in disarray. In just over 2 weeks, the peasants' revolt had shattered the rigid rules of medieval society. Peasants from Kent and Essex had overrun London and forced the king to agree to a face-to-face meeting. The Essex rebels camped here, a mile outside of London on the road to Essex, at a place appropriately called Mile End. There's the station over there. It was here on the 14th, only a fortnight after the revolt had started, that the King of England himself rode out to meet the rebels. It was confusing, scary. The king himself was under threat. He was Daniel in the lion's den. But was the royal party right to be so scared?
They were. The threat was very serious indeed. Half of the country was involved with the rising now. They were in very serious trouble and they knew it.
So when they got here, what happened?
Well, they approached the crowds. You have to bear in mind there's a huge crowd. You had the Essex Army here, about 30,000 peasants in the Essex Army. The London population had turned out to join this enormous gathering. This was an extraordinary moment in English history.
And what did they want?
They drawn up 4 demands. One was for an end to bonded labour, which meant that the peasant would be able to work for any lord they chose to work for.
So they wouldn't be serfs anymore?
Exactly, that would be the end of serfdom,
yeah.
Absolutely right. The second related demand was that any peasant would be able to sell their produce as they chose on the London market or wherever. In other words, they wouldn't be forced to hand over tribute to the local lord.
So these are guys arguing for a free market, basically?
Well, they certainly wanted the freedom to trade as they chose, yeah. That's right.
And the third?
The third demand was for land rent to be reduced to 4p an acre. Now this is interesting because land rent varied enormously across England. Some peasants had to pay up to 2 shillings a year per acre for their land. So to reduce that to 4p an acre across the country suggested they had a national plan, a national vision for how things could be different.
This was a demand based on economic theory?
Maybe theory is too strong a word, but they certainly had economic ideas. This wasn't some crazy, chaotic outburst, some irrational outburst. They had an economic plan for how England could be organised differently.
So that's 3 demands.
The fourth demand was that nobody should be punished for having taken part in the rising.
So the king's confronted by all these radical demands. What does he do?
He concedes. He knows he has no choice. They're really in a corner at this point.
How did the rebels know he'd keep his word?
They got it in writing. It's the same today, isn't it? You don't just take someone's word for it, you get it in writing. They demanded charters of freedom for every single village represented at Mile End that day.
This was unbelievable. The king had granted every one of the peasants' demands. At a stroke, he'd agreed to dismantle the entire structure of medieval society, ending serfdom and producing signed documents to make it official. And this is the evidence, a contemporary copy of one of the charters recorded by a chronicler. In trying to hang on to his kingdom, Richard was willing to sacrifice almost anything and anyone. The rebels thought they'd got what they wanted, but the hated government officials were still in power. So they demanded the heads of Sudbury and Hales who'd been left behind at the Tower. And when the king murmured something about giving them justice, a group of them broke away, Tower and London Police, and raced back to London with the news that the king was throwing the traitors to the wolves. The Tower of London had never once fallen in its entire history, but this time it was different. When the rebels arrived, they found the drawbridge was down and the doors were open. The king, or someone close to him, was clearly on their side. On one level, they were like kids let loose in a sweet shop. They rampaged through the corridors, they burst into the Queen's bedroom, they ransacked her drawers, they bounced up and down on her bed. But that was just the fun part. They knew what they were really after, the blood of the poll tax traitors. Sudbury and Hales and co. must have known what was coming to them as this great crowd of men and women swept through the tower. Sudbury tried to escape, but he was spotted by a woman as he scrambled into a boat and was dragged away and thrown into this chapel. The country's #1 bishop and tax collector had got nothing left to do but pray. It took 8 blows to sever Sudbury's head from his body. Robert Hales was also executed. Their heads were paraded on spikes in celebration of the peasants' total victory. After just 2 weeks of rebellion, the peasants had overturned medieval society. They'd won their freedom and seen their hated enemies executed in cold blood. They trusted Richard to deliver. So even while the newly won charters of freedom were being signed, satisfied peasants started drifting back to their homes. If Richard's concessions had been intended to divide and rule, the tactic had worked. Down this little alleyway is the site of Richard II's bolt hole, a fortified house in the city walls known as the Wardrobe. It was here on the night of the 14th that a special team of 30 monks was drafted in to copy out the royal charters of freedom. But the amazing gains made at Mile End weren't enough for a hardcore of Kentish rebels led by Wat Tyler. Their ambition was nothing less than the overthrow of the entire system. And the next day, a final showdown between the roofer from Maidstone and the boy king would shape England's destiny for centuries. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, there was this extraordinary feeling of excitement and euphoria that ordinary people had overthrown a superpower. Something similar must have been in the air in June 1381. In just 2 weeks, the peasantry had thrown this rigid and oppressive regime into total disarray. The king had given in to all their demands. Not only that, but they'd got bits of paper to prove it. Royal charters actually signed by the king, which promised to do away with serfdom. Not only that, but he'd sacrificed the heads of some of the most hated and highest officials in the land just to appease their anger. The status quo had been stretched to breaking point. When news reached the authorities that Wat Tyler wanted further concessions, they must have realised a showdown with the hardcore rebels was inevitable. They had to come up with a strategy. Their plan to fight back all rested on the shoulders of a 14-year-old boy. Richard II knew he was going to need all the help he could get. At 3 o'clock on the 15th, the deeply religious young king came here to Westminster Abbey to pray at the shrine of his venerable ancestor, the Saint and King Edward the Confessor. He'd only have had the haziest idea of how